Before Ferrari ever questioned itself, it believed it had already found the answer. This belief did not emerge suddenly, nor was it the result of a single period of dominance. It was shaped gradually over years of presence, repetition, and survival. For much of its early history in Formula One, Ferrari did not see itself as merely another competitor sharing the grid. Inside Maranello, the team occupied a different mental space altogether, one defined not by comparison, but by assumption. Ferrari was not perceived as one participant among many, but as the axis around which the sport naturally revolved. Other teams came and went. They appeared with ambition, disappeared under pressure, merged when survival demanded it, or faded into irrelevance when resources ran out. Ferrari, however, remained, and that permanence was not interpreted as coincidence. It became a foundation for identity. Over time, this continuity shaped how Ferrari understood success, failure, and authority. Winning was not treated as surprise or achievement. It was treated as confirmation. Confirmation that the underlying philosophy was correct, that the structure did not require questioning. Losing, when it happened, was rarely internalized. It was explained away as circumstance, weather conditions, driver limitations, moments of bad luck, timing that failed to align. The explanation was always external, never philosophy, never structure. Ferrari did not exist inside Formula One in the same way others did. It did not see itself adapting to the sport. It believed the sport adapted around it. Formula One was not a system Ferrari needed to master. It was an arena Ferrari had already shaped through presence alone. And that belief, quietly reinforced year after year, created something more rigid than confidence. It created inevitability. That confidence did not exist in isolation. It was not the product of a single season, a single championship, or a single era of dominance. It was built slowly, reinforced year after year by history itself. Ferrari entered Grand Prix racing early, and from the beginning it endured conditions that destroyed others. Financial instability, political interference, internal rivalries, personal loss, periods of uncertainty that for many teams would have marked the end. Where others collapsed under pressure, Ferrari absorbed it and continued. Over time, survival stopped being a circumstance and became an argument. The fact that Ferrari remained was no longer seen as remarkable. It was treated as evidence. History was not something to be studied from a distance as a sequence of lessons or warnings. Inside Maranello, history was lived as validation. Every crisis endured without collapse reinforced the belief that the system itself was sound, that what had worked before did not need to be fundamentally questioned. Past survival was treated as future insurance. If Ferrari had outlasted competitors once, it would do so again. If it had endured hardship without abandoning its principles, then abandoning those principles seemed unnecessary. Adaptation was not rejected outright, but it was always framed as something Ferrari controlled, something initiated internally on its own terms. Change imposed from outside was instinctively suspect. After all, Ferrari's identity had been forged not by reacting quickly, but by enduring longer. Gradually, this created a subtle but powerful assumption: that legacy itself could function as strategy, that continuity could replace introspection, that history could compensate for structure. And for a time, this assumption appeared justified. Results did not immediately contradict it. Ferrari remained competitive, respected, central. From the inside, there was little reason to believe that history was no longer guiding the future, even as the sport around it was quietly beginning to move on. At the center of this worldview stood Enzo Ferrari himself. He did not understand his role as administrative or managerial in the modern sense. He saw himself as the guardian of something far less tangible, an idea. Ferrari, to him, was not simply a racing team, nor merely a manufacturer of cars. It was a statement about discipline, about hierarchy, about control. And those principles were not abstract concepts to be debated. They were lived, enforced, and embodied. Inside Maranello, this system was not described as rigidity. It was described as order, discipline, stability. In a world Ferrari perceived as politically unstable and constantly shifting, control was not simply a preference, it was a necessity. And Enzo Ferrari embodied that control completely. His presence influenced decisions before they were spoken. His expectations shaped conversations before disagreements could surface. Authority did not need to be asserted loudly. It was assumed. Over time, this environment produced a subtle consequence. Problems were often recognized internally, long before they were publicly acknowledged. Engineers sensed limitations. Drivers felt constraints. But within a system built on personal authority, dissent did not vanish. It learned to move carefully, to speak softly, to wait, and sometimes not to speak at all. In this way, authority did more than organize Ferrari's structure. It quietly defined the limits of what could be questioned and when. This philosophy did not stop with people. It extended naturally into the machines themselves. At Ferrari, a racing car was never treated as a neutral object, a collection of parts to be optimized in isolation. Every design decision carried meaning. Every technical choice reflected a broader worldview. Engineering was not separated from identity, it expressed it. Nowhere was this more evident than in the position of the engine. For Ferrari, this was not simply a variable to be adjusted in pursuit of performance. It was an expression of order. The engine belonged at the front, not only because it had always been there, but because it symbolized hierarchy. Power led, control followed, the driver responded. This configuration aligned perfectly with how Ferrari understood authority itself: structured, linear, predictable. Front-engine cars behaved according to principles Ferrari trusted precisely because they were familiar. Their limits were known, their behavior refined through decades of experience. To abandon that layout was not merely to adopt a new technical solution. It was to question the underlying structure Ferrari believed had brought it success. In Maranello, technical decisions were inseparable from philosophy. To move the engine was to move authority itself. Elsewhere, however, a quiet shift was taking place. In modest British workshops, far removed from Ferrari's resources, prestige, and history, engineers began asking different questions. Instead of pursuing maximum power, they focused on balance, weight distribution, driver feedback. Their solutions were not dramatic, they were pragmatic, incremental, shaped by necessity rather than ideology. From Ferrari's perspective, these ideas appeared clever but insubstantial, interesting experiments perhaps, but not enduring answers. Rear-engined cars in particular were viewed as temporary deviations, technical shortcuts that sacrificed tradition for convenience. In Maranello, there was little concern that such concepts would redefine the sport. History, after all, had already shown which philosophy endured, or so it seemed. When British cars began to win races, Ferrari did not immediately interpret those victories as a signal of structural change. At first, they were understood as exceptions, anomalies produced by specific tracks, favorable conditions, or extraordinary drivers. There was always an explanation that preserved the core belief: Ferrari did not need to change. The world, it was assumed, would eventually return to order. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the pattern shifted. Rear-engine cars were no longer winning occasionally, they were winning consistently. They allowed drivers to push closer to the limit with greater confidence. They responded faster to development, adapting more easily to new circuits and changing regulations. While Ferrari continued refining components within a familiar framework, its rivals were refining concepts themselves. And that difference, over time, began to matter. Ferrari still possessed power, prestige, history. Its cars were strong, its name central to the sport's identity. But something more subtle was beginning to slip away, something far more dangerous than race results alone. Ferrari was losing inevitability. The unspoken assumption that Ferrari would always find a way, simply because it was Ferrari, began to erode. Inside Maranello, this realization did not trigger open confrontation. It produced tension. Engineers could see the evidence accumulating. Drivers could feel the difference on track. But acknowledging the problem meant questioning assumptions deeply tied to identity. And questioning Enzo Ferrari was never simple. Change, in this context, no longer felt like innovation, it felt like admission. By the end of the decade, Ferrari faced a contradiction it could no longer fully ignore. Its cars were powerful, but increasingly constrained. Development cycles slowed, flexibility diminished. The system that had once guaranteed survival was now limiting adaptation. Ferrari would soon change, not because it wanted to, but because survival, the very principle that had defined its certainty, would leave it no alternative. And with that realization, the illusion of certainty quietly began to crack.
Ferrari did not change because it believed it needed to. It changed because it was forced to, and that distinction matters more than it might initially appear. By the early 1960s, Formula One itself was no longer the same environment Ferrari had learned to dominate. The sport was evolving, not gradually, but structurally. Smaller British teams, operating far from the traditions and hierarchies of Maranello, began redefining what competitiveness actually meant. They were lighter, more flexible, less constrained by legacy, free to experiment not only with machines, but with the way teams were organized and decisions were made. Within this new context, the rear engine layout was no longer an interesting deviation, it was becoming the standard. Race after race, its advantages became harder to ignore. Balance improved, handling sharpened, drivers gained confidence at the limit. The evidence accumulated quietly but persistently, and eventually Ferrari could no longer remain apart from it. When Ferrari finally adopted the rear-engine configuration, the decision was not framed as discovery or progress, it was framed as necessity, something imposed by circumstances rather than embraced by conviction. Inside Maranello, the change carried little sense of belief. It was treated as a concession, an adjustment made to remain present, not a transformation of understanding. The form had changed, but the philosophy had not. Power was still prioritized over balance. Authority still outweighed process. Tradition continued to substitute for structure. Ferrari had altered the position of the engine, but not the way it understood racing itself. And that gap, subtle, almost invisible at first, would soon prove far more dangerous than open resistance ever could.
For a brief period, results managed to conceal the deeper problem. On paper, Ferrari was still successful. Races were still being won. Points were still accumulated. Headlines continued to carry the familiar name. From the outside, the image of continuity remained intact. Ferrari still appeared present, still competitive, still relevant. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted. Victories no longer emerged from clear superiority or structural advantage. They were extracted, not delivered. They depended increasingly on effort, improvisation, and moments of individual brilliance compensating for weaknesses elsewhere. Each success required more energy than the last. Each race demanded sharper reactions, tighter margins, and greater strain. What had once felt controlled now felt fragile. The experience inside the team began to diverge from the results on the page. Races no longer unfolded according to expectation. Plans required constant adjustment. Outcomes depended more heavily on circumstance than design. Ferrari was still fighting at the front of the grid, but the sense of inevitability was gone. Winning no longer felt like confirmation, it felt like survival. Over time, this created a quiet but persistent tension. Numbers continued to suggest continuity. Points tables did not immediately contradict the narrative of competitiveness, yet the lived experience told a different story. Confidence was gradually being replaced by vigilance, dominance by endurance. Ferrari was still present, but presence alone was no longer reassuring. Success in this new context no longer offered clarity. It no longer confirmed that the system was sound. Instead, it obscured the growing distance between performance and structure. Ferrari was still winning, but those victories no longer explained themselves. They demanded justification. And the more they had to be explained, the clearer it became that something deeper was no longer working as it once had. While the public continued to see cars, lap times, and race results, a quieter breakdown was unfolding inside Maranello. From the outside, Ferrari still appeared intact, structured, authoritative, functional. But internally, the system that had once centralized control and provided clarity was beginning to fracture. Authority no longer moved in a single direction. Decisions overlapped. Orders contradicted one another. What had once been interpreted as discipline slowly transformed into uncertainty. Inside the factory, engineers and mechanics began to sense the shift long before it became visible. Clear lines of responsibility blurred. Guidance became inconsistent. Where direction had once existed, there was now hesitation. Questions went unanswered. Solutions arrived late or not at all. The environment changed in tone. What had once felt controlled began to feel tense, and tension over time became fear. The collapse did not announce itself dramatically. There were no public statements, no defining moments of rupture. It happened quietly, through departures that drew little attention, through individuals being sidelined rather than replaced, through voices that gradually stopped being heard in meetings where they had once mattered. Experience drained away not through confrontation, but through exhaustion. From the outside, Ferrari still looked whole. The cars still raced. The infrastructure still functioned. The name still carried weight. But internally, the organization was thinning. What was being lost was not yet technical expertise or mechanical capability. It was something more fragile and more dangerous. It was trust, cohesion, human continuity. Before performance visibly declined, before results collapsed, the foundation had already begun to erode. Ferrari's first real loss in this period was not speed or innovation, it was people. And once that erosion began, it would quietly shape everything that followed. It was within this increasingly unstable environment that Mauro Forghieri was pushed into a role far larger than his years should have carried, not as the result of long-term planning or deliberate succession, but through necessity. Ferrari did not prepare a transition, it reacted to a vacuum. The system that had once concentrated authority at the top now redistributed pressure downward, without redistributing support. Forghieri did not inherit a position carefully shaped for growth. He inherited a crisis already in motion. Expectations arrived immediately. Results were demanded instantly. Time, patience, and institutional protection were non-existent. He was asked not only to design solutions, but to stabilize an environment that was already fragmenting. In practice, he was required to mature faster than the organization around him was willing to change. His technical brilliance emerged under these conditions, not because the system nurtured it, but because survival demanded it. There was no margin for gradual learning. Every decision carried weight, every mistake carried consequence. Forghieri adapted because there was no alternative. He absorbed responsibility that would normally have been shared across layers of experience and structure. Once again, Ferrari made a familiar mistake. It mistook individual talent for structural solution. Rather than addressing the deeper organizational failures taking shape inside Maranello, it placed disproportionate faith in a single figure. The burden of continuity, innovation, and recovery was placed on shoulders still learning how to carry weight. In doing so, Ferrari repeated a pattern it had relied on before, trusting that exceptional individuals could compensate for systemic imbalance. And for a time, that belief would appear justified. But the cost of asking individuals to resolve structural problems would continue to accumulate, quietly shaping the limits of what even brilliance could sustain. The breaking point did not arrive through catastrophe, scandal, or public humiliation. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. It came in the moment Ferrari began to no longer recognize its own machines. What had once felt familiar, intuitive even, now felt distant, unstable. The cars still carried the badge, they still bore the color, but they no longer reflected a clear understanding of what Ferrari believed racing should be. The 156, once celebrated as a symbol of innovation and renewal, gradually became unfamiliar even to those who had designed it. Each correction introduced to solve one problem seemed to create another. Adjustments accumulated without coherence. Development moved, but without direction. The car survived season after season, but it did not truly evolve. It existed, but it no longer led. In many ways, the machine became a physical reflection of the organization behind it, sustained by history, moving by inertia, advancing without clarity. Ferrari continued to refine details while losing sight of the whole. Decisions were made, changes implemented, effort expended, yet the underlying uncertainty remained unresolved. On the grid, Ferrari was still present, still competing, still respected, but it was no longer feared. Rivals no longer measured themselves against Ferrari as an inevitable benchmark. The aura that once surrounded the team had thinned. The sense that Ferrari would always find a way, regardless of circumstance, had faded. And once inevitability disappears, it does not return easily. It cannot be reclaimed through nostalgia or reputation. It requires coherence, belief, alignment between structure and philosophy. By the end of this period, Ferrari had not yet collapsed, but it had lost something far more difficult to rebuild than speed alone. It had lost certainty, and with that loss, the limits of survival through endurance alone were finally exposed. What followed those turbulent years was not collapse, and that distinction matters far more than it first appears. Ferrari did not vanish from the grid, nor did it fade quietly into irrelevance. The factory gates in Maranello remained open. The red cars continued to appear on race weekends. Victories would return. Championships would once again be engraved with the Ferrari name. From the outside, the institution appeared intact, resilient, recognizable, almost unchanged. But survival is not the same as continuity. Something fundamental had been altered beneath the surface, and it could not be restored through results alone. Ferrari was still present, still capable, still competitive. Yet for the first time in its history, it existed without certainty. The assumption that success would eventually arrive simply because it always had, that quiet belief that time itself would correct any imbalance, was gone. Ferrari was no longer operating from inevitability, it was operating from effort. And effort, unlike dominance, leaves traces. It introduces tension where confidence once existed. It replaces instinct with calculation. Decisions that had once felt automatic now carried weight. Commands that had once been absolute were followed by hesitation. The organization had learned how to endure pressure, but not how to impose it. This shift was subtle, almost invisible to casual observers. There was no single moment when Ferrari publicly acknowledged what had changed, no admission, no statement, no reckoning delivered at a press conference. Instead, the realization settled internally, quietly. It appeared in the way decisions were debated rather than declared, in the way certainty gave way to caution, in the way authority was exercised with awareness rather than assumption. Ferrari had survived its most turbulent years, but survival reshapes institutions in ways victory never does. It teaches restraint, it leaves memory, and once certainty is lost, it does not simply return with trophies. It demands something deeper, a new understanding of how to exist in a world that no longer bends by default. Reconstruction did not begin with spectacle. There was no dramatic reset, no symbolic rupture with the past, no moment that could be framed as rebirth. What followed was slower, uneven, and far more uncomfortable. Ferrari did not rebuild itself through declarations, it rebuilt itself through process, quietly, imperfectly, and often reluctantly. Mauro Forghieri, once pushed aside during the height of internal turmoil, was gradually brought back toward the center of technical influence, not as a savior figure, but as part of a broader rebalancing. Alessandro Colombo departed, and more importantly, Ferrari ceased to exist as an entirely self-governed universe. With Fiat's entry, the company did not lose its identity, but it did lose its absolute autonomy. That shift proved decisive. For the first time, authority inside Maranello was no longer concentrated in a single will. Decisions began to circulate rather than descend. Oversight appeared where instinct had once ruled alone. Boundaries emerged. Accountability followed. Later, Luca di Montezemolo would play a crucial role, not by dismantling Ferrari's character, but by operating within a structure that Fiat's presence had made possible. What changed most was not passion nor ambition, it was process. Feedback, once filtered, dismissed, or quietly ignored, slowly returned. Decisions were no longer assumed to be correct simply because of where they originated. Ferrari did not abandon hierarchy, but it softened its edges. Listening became part of leadership, not a threat to it. These adjustments did not erase Ferrari's identity. They did not dilute its culture or ambition. What they did was make that identity sustainable. For the first time, Ferrari was no longer relying solely on belief to function. It was learning how to support belief with structure. And that distinction would shape everything that followed. Perhaps the most revealing irony of this entire period lies not in Ferrari's victories, but in one of its least successful machines. The 312B3, often remembered primarily for its disappointing results, played a far more important role than its record suggests. It did not restore Ferrari's dominance. It did not deliver championships, but it forced the team to confront realities it had long resisted. For the first time, certain methods could no longer be dismissed as theoretical distractions. Wind tunnel development was no longer treated as academic excess. External benchmarks, once viewed as foreign habits incompatible with Ferrari's identity, could no longer be ignored. Data, which had often existed in tension with instinct, began to coexist with it, not comfortably, but necessarily. The 312B3 exposed limitations that belief alone could not conceal. It demanded structure where intuition had once sufficed, discipline where experience had once been trusted to compensate. The car did not reward improvisation, it punished it, and in doing so, it introduced habits Ferrari had never truly needed before, because it had never believed it would need them. In this sense, the 312B3 became a transition rather than a failure. It marked a shift in how problems were approached and how solutions were validated. Progress was no longer assumed, it had to be demonstrated, measured, repeated. Slowly, these habits began to reshape the technical culture inside Maranello. From that transition emerged the foundations of the 312T era, one of the most dominant chapters in Ferrari's history. Technically, Ferrari recovered. It learned how to compete within a changing Formula One, but psychologically, it was no longer the same institution that had entered the 1960s, believing it defined the sport. Failure had done what success never had. It forced Ferrari to listen. What changed most profoundly during these years was not Ferrari itself, but how others began to see it. For decades, rivals had approached Maranello with a mixture of reverence and resignation. Ferrari was not just another competitor, it was a constant, an institution that seemed to exist above the normal cycles of rise and decline. That perception, however, did not survive the transformation of the sport. Gradually, the mystique surrounding the red cars began to fade, not through humiliation or dramatic defeat, but through exposure. Teams that had once measured themselves against Ferrari as an unreachable benchmark now studied it as an opponent, experienced, capable, but undeniably human. Ferrari could be beaten, planned against, outsmarted. Fear did not vanish in a single moment, it dissolved through familiarity. This shift revealed itself quietly, far from public view, in preparation rooms, in strategy meetings, in the way rivals stopped hoping for Ferrari to falter and began planning for it to resist. Ferrari was no longer treated as the fixed point around which Formula One revolved. It had become part of the system it once defined, one competitor among many, distinguished by history but governed by the same limits. And once inevitability disappears, it cannot be recovered through performance alone. Victories may be returned, titles may be won, but fear does not regenerate through results. It is built on uncertainty, on the belief that an opponent cannot be fully understood or contained. That belief was gone. What remained was a different kind of respect, earned rather than assumed. Ferrari was still formidable, still capable of excellence, but it no longer dictated the psychological landscape of the sport. Formula One had changed, and Ferrari, whether it wished to or not, now existed within it, not above it. The end of fear did not diminish Ferrari's importance, it simply marked the moment when history stopped protecting it. In hindsight, these years are often described as crises. But crises imply temporary disruption, moments that pass, conditions that eventually resolve themselves. What Ferrari experienced was something deeper and far more enduring. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with a reality the team had never truly faced before. The realization that its greatest strength and unwavering belief in itself could also become its greatest vulnerability. For decades, Ferrari had relied on identity as protection. Legacy substituted for clarity. Authority replaced listening. Success reinforced the assumption that the system did not require examination. But once inevitability disappeared, those mechanisms no longer functioned. Belief alone could not compensate for misalignment. History could not substitute structure. And confidence, when left unquestioned, revealed its limits. The victories that followed were real. The championships were earned. Ferrari would continue to inspire, to innovate, and to win. But it would do so in a world that no longer waited for it to arrive, a world that had learned it could be challenged, questioned, occasionally surpassed. Ferrari was no longer insulated by myth. It had become accountable to reality. And that accountability changed everything. Ferrari could no longer assume it defined Formula One. It had to understand it. It had to respond rather than dictate, to adapt rather than endure. Authority no longer replaced dialogue. Listening became essential, not optional. That is the quiet legacy of those years. Not the cars that failed, not the races that were lost, but the moment when being different stopped being enough, when survival alone no longer proved correctness, and Ferrari, for the first time in its history, had to learn how to listen.